national monuments and the, all of that extend beyond that line. And why? Because that's not jurisdiction of the United States, right? It's not jurisdiction of Montana. It's a jurisdiction belonging to another people, the Canadian people, if you will, or even the province, which that's a whole other thing that we could talk about. And then you look at the state of Montana, there's boundaries. And you go into it, and you see counties and county lines. And you go into it further, and you see other lines that are a lot smaller, and they got a home on it. That is personal jurisdiction. And the founders looked at that as something that you can't invade, that you're not supposed to invade. You're not supposed to go and just kick in the door because of whatever reason. That jurisdiction is the most sacred jurisdiction of all. It belongs to you and I. See if I can get it up here. Our bodies, our homes, our transportation, and our other property, and I could list all those. But that's what this is about. And in fact, when we talk about fighting the UN or not wanting the United States to join the UN, what we're actually saying is we don't want or need another jurisdiction. Amen. And it also, we're saying that, look, we have already said constitutionally what jurisdiction our United States government has. And we feel that if we join the UN, well, I mean, if we don't get out of it, but the issue there is not a constitution that really limits. They make their own supposed limitations. And we actually put ourselves outside the protection of a constitution. And so you begin, hopefully, to see the seriousness of jurisdictions and why it is so important that we make sure that our public lands, our homes, the private property, vested property ownership on the lands is protected. And that the jurisdictions are correct. Because right now these lands are not in a Republican form of government. You cannot correct what is happening. And no matter how many associations you participate in, no matter how much communication or joint efforts that you have with these jurisdictions that shouldn't be here in the first place, no matter how much you try, unless you follow the lines of the legal lines, the lawful lines, the constitutional lines of jurisdiction, you cannot solve the problem. You cannot be in control of your own lands. And so, with that, I'll maybe change gears a little bit. Because my family, my father he's an extremely intelligent man that has a very difficult time sometimes of articulating what he is trying to explain. But I had the privilege of being able to be his son. And we didn't always get along. That's very, I've said that many times. But what I was able to do is listen to him and see how he acted and understand. And so I was able to see, the wisdom in what he was trying to explain. I had the privilege, rather than like a meeting like this, I had the privilege of being with him and understanding what he was trying to explain. And this helped me understand truth and helped me understand these constitutional boundaries, helped me understand all of this. And I truly began to believe and understand. And I think as time has gone on, I even had to prove to myself that what he was saying was true. And I think that's pretty natural of growing up. But my father established very early in my life this jurisdictional understanding. And I'm so grateful for that. But it also has caused my family a tremendous amount of trouble. And as you know, in 2014, federal agents come and converge upon my family's ranch. I could go into a tremendous amount of detail on that. But one of the things they began to do is they were in the mountains, and they, with a backhoe and a dump truck, and they were up there destroying our water rights. Destroying our water infrastructure, I should say. Actually tearing them out. And then, just trying to tear them out and cap them off. Now, why would they do that? I mean, and they were doing it with armed men. In fact, when we first saw the backhoe and the dump truck coming out of the mountains, it was being escorted by 13 armed vehicles. And you have to ask, why? Why were they doing that? Why was it so, why was it so heavily armed? And the reason why is because they knew exactly where my father where his rights were established. They knew where the argument was. And they also knew state law. And they knew that the state had jurisdiction. And so they were out there destroying my father's water rights, the water infrastructure. And the reason why is because state law on water rights, basic in Nevada, says that if you don't prove up on it within a period of time, which is right around 5 years, meaning if you don't use it or you don't improve it, if you can't prove what's called beneficial use, then you actually lose it and somebody else can claim it. So the federal government, by force, was going up there and making sure that my father could not use his livestock watering rights deemed with the state of Nevada. And they were going to continue to enforce that past the limit in which we can no longer claim that right. And then you know what they were going to do after that time frame? They were going to file on it in their name. Now you might say, well, how do you know that, Ammon? Well, the reason I know this is because in the state of Nevada alone, under 4 federal agencies, they have done it 5,072 times in Nevada, where they actually took private property or private water rights, and through whatever method, many methods were used, they actually pushed the owner off, and then once the owner has abandoned his rights, after a period of time, they come in and actually file under the name of U.S. Forest Service or BLM or U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, whatever it is, and actually take title in the state or in the state registry. Now that's happened in all these states, just so you know. Nevada is not alone in that. I only did the research in Nevada, and I did that in 2014. And I only did it under 4 federal agencies. 5,072 water rights. What is happening to our rights? They're actually taking deed in the state. The federal government is taking them, claiming them as their own. That's exactly what's happening. Well, how many water rights do you think there are? I don't know, actually, in Nevada. But that's a pretty big chunk. They're actually stealing them. Now, wait a minute. I thought we had jurisdiction limitations. Did you know that Article 1, Section 8, Clause 17 limits the federal government from owning and controlling property inside the states unless it's for basically military purposes, for the use of dockyards, arsenals, and other needful buildings? That's the limitation. They basically said unless you are using the land and the resources for military purposes and other enumerated purposes, meaning you don't have authority to own. So this very problem that we are seeing with water, we've talked about it, is all solved in the Constitution. It's solved by the Constitution, by sticking to the limits and enumerations found in the Constitution. And that's why we're so radical about the Constitution. That's why we're so fanatical, right? That's why we keep saying Constitution, Constitution, Constitution. And maybe if you want to say the left or the right, whatever, if you want to say that, maybe they're called us constitutional radicals, well, okay, I'm okay with that. Because it protects them just as much as it protects me. Because Now, I kind of, in a roundabout way, made a little bit of a promise. And I'm out of time, which has gone by really fast. I hope I haven't bored you to death. But I really do feel like I need to keep that promise, but also share with you something that is really sacred to me, actually. Because many of you know that in early 2016, that I went with several friends and ranchers into the Maui National Wildlife Refuge, and basically just went in there and started living there. And there was two main reasons why we did this. One is because there was a family that was in extreme duress, and they were being ignored. And they were going back to prison for a second time for the same charges for 5 years, for the remainder of 5 years. And they were completely ignored by their locals, their state, and their federal, elected representatives or jurisdictions, if you will. And what had happened to them was just so extreme in corruption, I can't even, but basically it came to the point where it could not just be ignored. There had to be something done. We could not just go home and say, well, the poor Hammonds. We could not do that anymore because of what had happened to them, and how going home, if we would have just gone home and ignored it, it would have set a precedence that said it's okay to do this to a family. And this is after a long line of abuse to them and to many other ranching families and the other agricultural community or rural American families. So, number one, we went in there to bring attention to the atrocities committed by the U.S. government, U.S. Attorney's Office, upon this family. To bring attention. And to bring attention and to do our best to educate the American people on jurisdiction. And we did that the best we could, to the point where the government was losing their narrative. And actually now we have emails and documentations among them that was saying the virus is spreading, talking about our message, and that it had to be stopped. One of these emails was from Governor Kate Brown. And 2 days later, they killed LaVoy Finico. That was the reason why. Now, while we were there, we had many visitors. And we had many state legislatures come visit us. There are some are in this room right now. We had many county commissioners, representatives from all over the Western United States visit us. And we were teaching them this jurisdiction the best we could and why we were there. We had families, we had elementary classes that come and did their school reports on what was happening there. Is that what the media was telling you?
No.
No, the media was telling you that we were a bunch of armed militants hiding behind brick walls or rock walls with our AK-47s in our hand. It was a complete lie, just like they lied about this meeting here. That's a whole other issue. But I want to show you some things that some very special individuals gave me while I was there. And I've shared this a couple times, but I haven't shared it with very many people. And I'm going to put this. Here. First of all, I have to, oh wait a minute, that's not it. I have to do that. Speaking of hats, there was a man who served in the Army, came to visit us more than one time, and he wanted to give me something, and he had this hat. And it was Army on the back, airborne, and he said that he served in the Army, I can't remember how many years, but I think they call it a paratrooper. Yep. And he, this is what he did, and this was a hat that was special to him. And he took it off his head, just like this, and he gave it to me. He says, I want you to have something. I don't have anything else, but I want you to have this. And I know that this hat meant something to him, you know, that it meant, and actually he told me that it represented his service and why he jumped out of planes and why he did what he did to protect the people. And he wanted me to have that because he felt like I was doing the same thing, or we were doing the same thing. So he gave me that. Another man, which I do not have it because the FBI took it from me, along with my wedding ring. But he was a police officer for 25 years. And he gave me his duty badge. And I kept it in my pocket. Because every time I would get, you know, what we were doing was pretty hard. And every time I'd get to where I'd feel like it was too hard to do, I'd reach in and I'd feel that duty badge. Because he said, I feel like what you're doing is what I did for 25 years. Protecting the individual. And he wanted me to have that. And when I was arrested, they took it, and they won't give it back to me. Then another man came in, and this man had no legs. He was in a wheelchair. And he had lost his legs serving in the military. And he came to me, and he wanted me to have this. Now, I haven't served in the military, so I don't know everything about this jacket, but I believe he was in the Navy, and I believe he was a diver. And I think each one of those is 4 years. That'd be 20 years he served. And this was his dress uniform. And get here. And he says, I want you to have this because what you're doing is what I did. And the whole reason why I went into the military, to protect and defend the individual. I want you to have this. Now, I have never put this on, and I never ever will. Because I don't, it's not mine. Even though he gave it to me. Another man who served, I think he said 22 years, came to the refuge. And he came in full uniform. he presented to me his bronze star. Which was presented to him because of valor and bravery. Now, this man told me that he had served in 12 combat missions. And he wanted me to have it. And I didn't want to take it. I thought, how in the world can he give me this? But he insisted on it. Now, when I was in California speaking a few months ago, I told the audience there that I didn't feel I was worthy of it. And then last month I was speaking at the Second Amendment rally in Idaho. I was standing on the state capitol building. And that man hunted me down. And the reason why he came to me down, because he told me that I was never to say again that I was not worthy of this. That I didn't deserve it. Because he insisted that I did. Insisted that I was given this because I deserved it. And I promised I would never tell anybody that I didn't deserve it, whether I believe it or not. Now, there was one more gift given to me. And you can't, on any of these gifts, say the one's greater than the other. I want to show you something here. I really need to get this in some plastic or something. But this is a flag that was presented to me by a man who said that this flag was draped over his brother's casket because he died serving this country. And when they fired the shots, I guess it's a tradition or whatever that the rounds, they fold up inside the flag. And those rounds are in here. I've never unfolded it, I never will. But this man gave me this flag because he felt that this is what his brother died for. He felt that we were doing, and we were standing up for the very purpose in which his brother gave his life for. Now I speak to the media because this was not what the media was telling the world was happening. And in a way, the media is responsible for the death of one of the best men in our generation, Whitefish. Because they spun this narrative that we were something that we weren't. That we were standing for something that was not true. That it was about violence and force and intimidation, which was the exact opposite. They were calling good evil and evil good. And a good man lost his life. And liberty and freedom was pushed down the road. And myself, my brothers, my father, and many friends suffered for many, many months. And my wife and my children. Because they would not report properly. We allowed the media to come down into the refuge, to come into the buildings, full access. They knew what was happening. And they would go back up on the hill and say armed militants. And so, I know I need to close, but I want to share that, emphasize again, why we have done what we have done, and why it is so important, and why the very liberty of individuals depends upon people standing and saying no. Because we've heard a lot of problems here tonight. And we've heard some solutions. But there is no solution that can solve this issue if the individuals will not stand and say no. They must stand and say no. You do not have jurisdiction over my life, over my home, over my property. No. You do not have jurisdiction to come over into the states and take and control the property, to control our natural resources. You do not have that jurisdiction. It's interesting to note that in I can't remember, it's 1880s or so, that we have the 13th Amendment, right, to the Constitution, which basically states that all men are equal, right? I mean, we knew that, but they actually made the amendment that made it slavery illegal. But yet 100 years later, we have the black community fighting for equality. And it was legitimate. They had a right to feel like they weren't equal when they had bathrooms that they had to go in where they couldn't go into the white man's bathroom. They couldn't sit at the front of the bus. But why are they having to fight that 100 years later? And it's because it took them 100 years to get the strength, the courage, and the fortitude, and the confidence to say, look, you will treat us equal. Did you know that Martin Luther King Jr. was put in jail 29 times? It wasn't until, and it is not, until a people stand up and say no. It's not until they stand up and say no that the legislatures, all of them follow, and that the courts follow. It has to be the people first. It has to be. They have to say no, just like my dad, when they came to say, we're closing your allotment, as they said. We're taking your ranch away. And my dad said, no. And then they come and said, well, we're going to take it anyway? And my dad said, hell no. And then 20 years later, 20 actually plus years later, they actually come to do it. And my dad was true to his word. And the American people surrounded my family in protection. Because these jurisdictions that were set to protect my family and others, they had lost their purpose. They had actually become the tool in which they were taking the rights. So the American people had to say no. And they did. And they were assertive. And now, today, my father ranches. And has continued to ranch for 143 years in our family. Now, my message is this. Beyond everything that I said, you cannot change anything unless you say no. And I would challenge you to go into history and prove me wrong. You have to say no. You have to unite around the person that says no to their rights. You have to unite together and say no. And I challenge people in this county to unify and say no.